Recently, I started wanting to play around with Windows 98, kind of a nostalgia slash technical nerdy experiment thing. You know what I'm trying to say.
Of course you can grab a computer from the era, and I did.
A lot of them still work, especially when it comes to doing things from the era, but they're a little clunky, and even with their much simpler operating system, not all that fast. I mean, that's not exactly groundbreaking information, but I started to think, what if they were all that fast and all not less that clunky?
Of course, that might be part of the charm, depending on your nostalgic brew, but I got to thinking, what if it was running on brand new hardware? And I'm not talking about a virtual machine, I mean on the metal, running natively on the hardware. Could that really be done?
Now you might be thinking, Windows 98 is like super old, dude, and with how powerful computers are now, Matt, of course Windows 98 can run on a new computer, you goober. Idiot.
As a matter of fact, you're right. Intel CPUs are more or less completely backwards compatible all the way back to the 8086 from 1978. They even start up in 16-bit real mode to this day.
That's right, your $3,000 gaming rig with 12 cores, 64-bit CPU, and 64 gigs of RAM still spends the first few seconds when you start it up as a 16-bit computer with access to only 1 megabyte of memory, until your BIOS or Windows kicks it up to 64-bit mode.
The problem with modern hardware is really everything else. If you've ever built your own computer or reinstalled Windows, you're probably familiar with the concept of installing drivers.
And you know how many Windows 98 drivers have been released in the last 15 years? Survey says! These early DOS-based Windows versions also struggle a little with too much memory, which sounds kind of ridiculous now, but
indeed, in an era where 64 megabytes was impressive, there wasn't much thought to memory amounts that were over 1 gigabyte. Luckily, you can limit the amount of memory Windows can see in software, so you don't have to start removing or replacing RAM sticks to get under the threshold. And this is indeed the official solution. No patch or update, you just can't have more than 1 gig, deal with it.
So basically, while you'd think old software would have no problem running on newer hardware, it's really usually the other way around. While newer software will be slow on old hardware, it usually at least supports the hardware and knows how to deal with it. Mostly. So why bother doing this when I'm pretty sure it's not gonna go that well? I don't know, but you know what they say. Working with technology is like a box of chocolates, as in delicious and should be eaten in moderation. Let's install Windows.
This is a ThinkPad T470. It's about 1.5 years old, but whatever, perfectly modern enough for our tests. Here are the specs if you're interested. Now currently this thing is running Windows 10, and I don't yet feel like wiping it for Windows 98, so I'm gonna add another condition to this. I want to run Windows 98 from USB. Well, this'll certainly be interesting. As far as I know, MS-DOS never supported USB, and Windows 98 can't even read USB flash drives without installing a driver.
But you can run DOS off a USB. I know that, because Rufus knows that.
Yes, my good friend Rufus, who's full of all sorts of neat tricks, including making a bootable DOS USB. I want to find out more about how this works. I figure if DOS can run off a USB, then DOS-based Windows can too. But I need to know whether DOS really is running off the USB, or if it's just some floppy disk emulation or something. My first impulse was to test in VMware so that I, wouldn't have to get up. But it turns out that neither it nor VirtualBox support booting from USB, at least not in BIOS mode. Damn, maybe I'll have to get up after all. Or maybe not. A quick Google search found Plop Bootloader, a small program that runs off CD or floppy and then lets you boot to other things. Which actually worked. Nice, we're officially in FreeDOS. And what do you know, it really is running off the USB. As far as DOS is concerned, the USB drive is its C drive. This is looking good. Something that's nice about the Windows 98 installer is it really can run from anywhere, provided it's loaded from DOS, so I can literally copy the installer files onto the flash drive, run it from the flash drive, and use it to install Windows on the same flash drive, which helps since modern laptops often don't have a CD drive. Also, since the installer is running from DOS, it should carry over this apparent USB support, at least for now. Alright, let's give it a shot. I'm back in FreeDOS and I'm gonna try running the Windows 98 installer. Hey nice, we're in ScanDisk. Remember this shit? But it's kinda slow. I guess that's what I get for running from USB. Now, technically you can't start the setup without running ScanDisk, or at least that's what they want you to think. But this is the DOS era. There's nothing you can't do with some well-placed switches on the command prompt. The setup actually has several of these, but for now we're only interested in this, skipping ScanDisk. Here we go. Okay, not what I expected. I was stumped for a while here. I kept trying different switches and kept getting the same disk errors until I realized the USB is indeed write protected. It's purely read-only. At first I thought Rufus's magical DOS USB was indeed just too good to be true, but actually it isn't. The problem was in fact plop bootloader, which in the interest of making it small and floppy, disk size, it contains no write routines for its USB drivers. That's a bummer. From what I can tell, there's no other way to boot directly from USB in a virtual machine, so here we go. I'm getting up. Don't try and stop me. It's time to start testing on the real metal. First things first, I gotta change the boot mode to compatibility mode because DOS booting just isn't as fashionable anymore. Alright, let's plug in the USB and... nice, it boots first try. Score 1 real computers. Well, let's get started. Okay, this actually isn't that unexpected. Remember what I said about 16-bit real mode only having access to about 1 megabyte of RAM? That's where we are now, and the setup wants a whopping 3. Well, 2.8. To access more memory, we're gonna need to install a DOS driver. Back in the day, this was usually HiMem.sys, but it's a little buggy and contributes to a lot of those memory issues I mentioned earlier. Plus, I already tried it and it didn't work. Luckily, a bunch of community-made alternatives exist, such as XMGR and HiMemX. First, I'm going to try HiMemX because I read about a lot of people having success with it. All we have to do is copy it to the USB and add it to config.sys. If only things were still that easy. HiMemX gets us a little further in the setup, but still eventually Windows was asking for the real HiMem to stand up. Well, XMGR it is. Let's see what happens.
Ugh, so close yet so far.
What a tease. What if I'd just gone out and bought 2.8 megabytes of RAM, only for it to then ask for an additional 13.2?
If only it knew there were actually 500 times that amount in this computer.
I tried a bunch of different setup switches and XMGR configurations, but nothing worked. I kept getting stuck at this error message. But eventually I stumbled upon something else. Something magical. A bunch of them actually. Switches for the Windows 98 setup. The kind of switches Donald Trump would build a wall to keep out. These switches are completely undocumented.
We will build a great wall along Windows.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't know about these before. Well, I guess because they're undocumented, but it turns out there's like 100 switches that the setup makes no mention of in its help. And we're interested in one particular one, /NM for no minimum. This bypasses all checks for minimum hardware and just barrels along with the installer and... even the touchpad works out of the box, which I probably shouldn't be surprised about, but I am. Well, it's finally time to install Windows 98, and also readjust the camera. It really is fascinating seeing the Windows 98 setup on such a modern computer. I won't make you sit through the entire setup, but this first stage went flawlessly. Now, let me just say this first stage looks a lot like Windows, but it isn't Windows 98. It actually looks a lot closer to a stripped-down Windows 3. It's a little more tied to DOS than Windows 98 itself is. But the second stage is 98, and of course this first stage makes a bunch of changes to the disk and the boot process, and often installs its own HiMem.sys, which is much older in this case. So suffice to say, I don't quite expect the second stage to start flawlessly. But let's see what happens. Ooh, look at this classic startup screen. In fact, you can look at it for a long time because it never changes. Indeed, Windows is once again having trouble starting up. Looking at the USB, you can see that indeed Windows has its own HiMem.sys that it's probably using instead of our replacement. Swapping it out with our new one should fix that right up. Alright, let's try this out. You can see XMGR loads during startup. And yeah, we're in stage 2 of the Windows 98 setup. So by this point, things were going really well, but it's also the point where things started to go downhill. After it does a few things, like look for plug-and-play hardware, good luck, and a bunch of other stuff, it gets to this infamous updating system settings section, symbolized by this somewhat jittery drum beat. This usually takes a stupidly long time, at least on hardware for the era, and here it isn't all that fast, but the problem is this. Suddenly, something crashed. Now, I've never seen this happen before. It's obviously not supposed to happen. Also, the crash dump is missing the letter U and the letter Y, which is really weird. Well, at this point, there isn't much I can do except ignore it and hope it doesn't happen again. But it did. again and again. Things kept crashing and I had no idea why. When the setup finally completed, it just hung. I left it for minutes and no change. Eventually, I just had to do a hard reset. Well, I'm not feeling very hopeful about this install, but let's see what happens. The first thing it did was detect a broken registry and asked me to run scanreg, which, alright. Okay, I don't know what's typing this gibberish into the prompt. What's running in the audio exec? Literally the gibberish. This is, supposed to be readable, or empty. What the hell is going on? So I ran scanreg and it said it fixed things, but as I learned from years of watching House MD,
everybody lies.
Next boot, it told me the exact same thing. In fact, never stopped telling me this. I thought I may as well just try to boot. I mean, can't be any more broken than it already is. Desktop? Further than I expected. That's more like it. Well, it didn't get any further than this, which honestly seems about right. The real question is, what in the fuck happened? It was all looking so promising up until then.
Well, all the crashes and gibberish and missing letters reek of file corruption, and it's really completely possible that the USB is just broken. So, in order to rule out the simplest option, I did it all again.
I'm trying a newer SanDisk flash drive instead of the store brand one from Dick Smith. Yes, the real name of the store, but even after doing everything again, it was still the same deal. Completely smooth up until the very last moment.
Just like me when I flirt.
Well, I had no clue, but I did have sort of an idea. Having ruled out the USB itself, I started thinking about memory again, specifically since the first crash dump mentioned page faults. As kind of a shot in the dark, I did read about people having success with HiMemX, so I thought, what if I start the first stage with XMGR, and then swap it out with HiMemX for stage 2?
And yes, this is a lot more complicated than it needs to be. But you know what? It actually worked.
With HiMemX in the second stage, it happily drummed along all the way to the end with no issues. So yeah, I wasn't lying that it was weird with memory. It's been pretty much the cause of every problem so far. Alright guys, prepare for the first boot. Fingers crossed. Oh, looking good. We got a cursor. We got a mouse cursor and the classic ritual of going through plug-and-play devices it found. And hey, here we go. And the welcome app thing. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. For reference, this is what it's supposed to look like. And that was on a considerably less powerful machine. But hey, you can't really blame it. It's got no graphics drivers apart from the default generic VGA one. Unfortunately, as I alluded to earlier, locating drivers is really what's going to be the big problem. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that Lenovo hasn't dropped Windows 98 drivers for this computer. Though, probably wouldn't hurt. Maybe then you could write the drivers yourself. And I've already accepted that no matter how many drivers we do find, this setup will never have Wi-Fi. But as far as graphics drivers go, there actually is kind of a solution. If you've ever installed Windows XP and noticed it can usually run at 800 by 600 and higher even without graphics drivers installed, this driver uses that same technology to provide high resolutions to Windows 98 all the way up to 2560 by 1600. Now, it is still a generic graphics driver, so there's little, if any, hardware acceleration. But hey, at least we could not be restricted to 640 by 480 and 16 colors. And, 2 colors. Come on, you know we gotta see what this looks like. Oof, yummy. Oh god, that looks so good. Alright, let's try loading in this new driver. It comes with a bunch of different versions for different graphics chips and different amounts of video memory, with the highest being 128 megabytes. So, much like the RAM situation, it's likely that some of your video memory is gonna go to waste here. But hey, it's Windows 98, so how graphically intensive is it gonna be? As expected, it installs with no issue, and before you know it, we're restarting. And yeah, okay, it's not high res, but it is full color. Just for comparison, this is what it looked like with only 16 colors. And in the control panel, we can turn the res all the way up to the monitor's native resolution, which is indeed 1920 by 1080. Hell yeah, dude. This is Windows 98 in full 1080p HD running on native modern hardware. In fact, it actually might even be a little too high res. It's only a 14-inch screen, and some of this text is kind of hard to read.
Now, there is actually a reason for this. Yes, that is a 1080p screen, but it really behaves more like a 1280 by 720 screen with about 50% more detail. Basically, rather than making screens bigger with more pixels, they're just cramming more of them into the same space. And then the software scales up the text and scales up the images, so it's just as readable and just as usable. But there's more clarity and smoothness to the text and a little more fine detail in the images.
Windows 10 supports this natively, as does macOS with its Retina displays and also some window managers in Linux.
Unfortunately, none of those are Windows 98, but you could argue that if you had a CRT, which was common back then, that accepted really high resolutions, as some of them did, it's essentially the same principle, cramming more pixels into the same area. And who said CRTs were obsolete?
For its credit, Windows 98 does support increasing the size of its text, but it's really not designed for this purpose. All it does is literally just use a larger font size, sometimes not particularly well, and sometimes not at all. This was more for people with impaired sight, not for indulging in more pixels per inch. In theory, you could just set the resolution to 1280 by 720 so that it's at least usable, but there isn't an option for it in the settings, and I didn't feel like digging through the driver to try and add it, if that is even possible. But hey, we got a graphics driver, more or less. Let's see what else we can find.
Unfortunately, not to spoil things for you, the answer turned out to be very little.
As I said before, no Wi-Fi driver, but there's also really no Ethernet driver, making this a completely offline machine. I did in fact find a DOS driver for this computer's Ethernet card, which was kind of amazing all things considered, but I don't know, if you can use DOS drivers in Windows, then I'm too dumb to figure it out. I tried installing the usual way and nothing happened, then I tried installing through the network control panel and all that happened was I got a bonus error message on startup saying it couldn't find the driver. I tried adding it to config.sys and it just caused it to hang on startup. I mean, all this assumes that I'm willing to tether myself to an Ethernet connection to use the internet.
Come on, who do you think I am?
Sound driver was equally fruitless. The Realtek HD driver for the sound card only supports as low as Windows 2000, and I'm honestly surprised it goes that far back. And I tried it anyway, but it did nothing. I then tried the Realtek AC97 driver that did support Windows 98, but it did not enable sound, still nothing at all. And without sound or internet, it's kind of a lame computer to use, even for 1998 standards.
Now, I could probably go out and find replacement hardware that's a little more compatible with Windows 98 than what we've got at least. But first of all, it's a laptop, so it'll be a little tough to swap parts out without them being external. And the thing is, there's no USB driver installed. Despite running off a USB flash drive, it won't actually read anything else from a USB, including like a peripheral. And secondly, if I start swapping out with older hardware, it's not really a modern computer anymore, is it?
This is also probably a good time to mention that it's actually really slow.
At times, probably even slower than this computer.
Now, I'm sure a lot of this is just the fact that it's running from USB, but in general it just seems sluggish and seems to struggle keeping up. Now, granted, maybe this is because of the generic graphics driver, but I also wonder if it doesn't support the laptop's various power-saving methods, so it's just like stuck at a low clock speed or something. It also seems to consume battery a lot quicker in Windows 98 than Windows 10, but maybe that's just because I can't change the screen brightness and it defaults to 100%.
I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough to really know the reasons behind these things, and I guess I don't care enough to find out.
I guess I can always play around with desktop themes. I used to love these things as a kid. The screensavers even scale up to 1080p really well. Too bad I can't say the same for the 800 by 600 wallpapers. I can also play solitaire. Ah yes, the things that entertained us back then. Or I can replace the startup screen by saving a 256 color bitmap as logo.sys. If only it was that simple today. This is a particularly vaporwavy startup screen I made a couple months ago. Ah yes, wonderful.
At the end of the day, would I recommend doing this? Not really. I mean, outside of the coolness factor of being like, oh wow, I did the thing, there's not much you can really do with it.
A virtual machine is faster in every single way. I never thought I'd be saying that. Just look at these comparisons. Not only that, but with VMware at least, you also get readily available drivers for everything. You can even set arbitrary resolutions so that everything is readable on your high-res screen in beautifully blocky pixels.
Now I have a theory that there's kind of a sweet spot around 2004 or so where the drivers still supported Windows 98, but the hardware had gotten much better from when 98 was in its prime. Yeah, up until around 2007 or so, where you get diminishing returns, dual cores became prevalent, which 98 has no support for, less driver support, etc. You know, there's probably a narrow window of time where you can grab hardware from that era and throw it all together, get an adapter for an SSD, get a proper graphics card. You can probably build the ultimate Windows 98 machine. Comment if you want to see me do that. But yeah, otherwise, not much else to say. It was a cool experiment, but stick to a VM. Back in 2007, I actually had this exact same desktop wallpaper on my computer at school, just for some kid to come up and say, "Hey Matt, that wallpaper's pretty gay." Memories.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. Just wanted to mention this video was edited in Olive, a video editor I've been working on for the last few months. It's free, open source, multi-platform, and aims to eventually be just as powerful as the high-end editors out there, while still being totally free and easy to use. It is currently in alpha, so it might not yet be ready to replace your editor of choice, but check it out. Development is very active, so if you find a bug or have a feature request, chances are it'll be fixed or implemented pretty quickly. Visit olivevideoeditor.org to download the latest version. Enjoy!